Welcome to another edition of Eye on the Issues, and today we are talking education, of course, in the state of Wyoming. Joining me now is Senator Charles Scott. He is the chairman of the Senate Education Committee. Sir, thanks for taking the time to talk, and let's begin by talking about your legislative history, if we can. How long have you been part of the lawmakers of Wyoming?
I'm finishing my 46th year. Been quite active. I was the sponsor of the bill that created the Hathaway Scholarship. Been responsible for several bills in the education area, but for years I was chairman of the Health Committee. And then in 2021, shifted to being chairman of the Education Committee.
So tell me why you chose to do that.
Well,
Why
I
are you
found
interested in education?
health was getting very frustrating because Obamacare was blocking the reforms that were needed, and it was the point I needed to change. And the longtime education chairman had not run for reelection, so there was an opening, and I asked to have that committee, and was given the committee. And it's very interesting. The first thing I did was I got a report that was done by the consultants the state had hired to do the recalibration of our finance system. And it was quite critical of the performance of our K-12 education system. Basically said we weren't getting our money's worth, and said that the kids that were testing basic and below basic on the assessment test that we give that covers reading were not reading well enough to, when they became adults, participate in the modern high-tech economy we're trying to build. And said that 45% of the kids were in that group. And I said, that's way too much, and been trying to figure out why since then. And as I've looked at it, and I've had quite a bit of help looking at it, it's not the money we spend, because that actually some of the best performing districts, there was a big difference among the districts. Some districts do very well. They have less than 30% of their kids in the basic and below basic categories. And conversely, 70% plus in the good categories, the proficient and advanced. Some districts are just the reverse of that. So big spread among the districts with an unsatisfactory state average, which has gotten worse since COVID. It's not money, because some of the best performing districts have the least to spend per pupil. The money was all over the place. It's not district size. That doesn't seem to make any difference, other than the very small districts on the assessment test tend to bounce around because the numbers are small. And that's what you'd expect. It's not the teachers. The teacher corps seems to be pretty uniform and pretty good right across the state. We do see some effect from poverty. The assessment test does record the kids who are in poverty, who are eligible for the free and reduced lunch program. They're recorded differently, and they don't do as well as the rest of the kids. So that does make a difference. But we find that more capable districts get those kids to performing above the state average for all the kids. So that's a problem that can be overcome. It looks like the principal problem we're having is the local school district management. If the local superintendent and the local school board prioritize building a bureaucratic empire or sports empire, or both, as they do here in Casper, then they tend not to do so well in the reading. They neglect that. And that's unfortunate, because that's the fundamental academic skill that is needed to succeed in life. We also see the same pattern in math, but I think changing the readings performance would be what would really change the outlook for our students. So that's that's a key, and we've been looking at this now for several years, and the strategy we've developed in terms of dealing with it is really twofold. We're trying to put more choice for the parents into the system so that they can get out of a school district that's not doing well and get their kids in a school that is performing. And we've got two approaches there. One is the charter schools within the school district. And they we have fought the educational establishment over that because they don't like the competition at all. Frankly, I think competition is what makes our world go round in this country. But they'd rather not have the competition. And we managed to get the ability to have a few more charter schools. We've got one here in Casper that I helped with. It's up and running and is doing quite well. We've got one in Cheyenne that's about to start, and one in Chugwater. But we need to get legislation to allow more of those because that is a remedy that works. We've passed a program to have a set of scholarships or vouchers where the money follows the child, and the governor vetoed the majority of that bill. But he left enough so that I hope we're going to be able to get a court test as to what we can do and what we can't, because there's some Wyoming constitutional provisions that we say you can't use education money on things that aren't public schools, and these are going to private schools and that sort of thing. And the legal advice we had was that if we didn't use monies that were dedicated to education, we could spend those monies on it. So that's what we're trying. We'll see whether that works or not. And we're looking at it. Did the governor veto enough so we need to pass another bill in this area? And that's an open question at this point. We're looking at it. And then we've got two pieces of legislation that we're really working at to try to remedy the problems in the public schools. One is a bill that would ultimately retain the children that are not learning how to read and say they've got to repeat the grades until they do learn how to read. And our thought is that the current policy, which is to socially promote everybody every year, is doing the child no favors. Because if they can't, the rest of academics assumes the child can read. And you get them up into the fourth, fifth, and sixth grade and high school even, and they can't read. They can't do the work. They're just frustrated, and that's where a lot of our discipline problems come from. So we need to stop that policy of just promoting everybody. We're looking at trying to make that mandatory, trying to give more authority to the parents in the process, and give the parents the ability to force the school district to pay attention to their child. Because some of them are just not. And we think parental involvement is an absolute key to successful education system. No, you're not going to get it from all the parents. So the school districts have to look at each child that's not doing well and say, what does that child need in order to succeed? And the better districts, we had Sheridan come talk to us, and they've been historically one of the better ones. And that was what they were doing. And I think that's something to imitate. And we think, frankly, if we retain a lot of students, that the population will get the word that there needs to be a local reform of their school system. Because clearly, within the current system, most school districts can perform a lot better than they are. You've got the good ones out there, and Sheridan and Worland, and Cody and Powell and Green River. Some of those have historically performed pretty well, and then you've got a bunch like Casper and Cheyenne that don't do very well, and some that are very poor. So we're looking for a bill to try to force improvements there, and then we're also working on an educational bankruptcy act, where the very worst districts would find their local manager replaced by a trustee in bankruptcy until they got the problems cured. But a district that's only getting 20 or 30% of its kids reading well enough, that's a disgrace and needs to have something done about it.
How many districts are there like that right now? Do you know?
There's about 10 out of the 48. And some of the smaller ones, yeah, they do poorly one year and better the next year, and you have to look at a number of years before they say you got a real problem there. But we've got some that have been consistently fairly bad, and there needs to be new management there. They just aren't performing, and um, we've had too much of complacent district management successfully recruiting school board members that will support them and don't want to rock the boat. And that's a real problem. We've got that problem here in Casper right now. We aren't bad enough to be in an educational bankruptcy, but we're still below an unsatisfactory state average, and that needs to be fixed. And that can be fixed by the local voters at the school board election if they'll pay attention. So
So,
that's a major focus of what we're trying to do. Uh, if I may, I would mention two other issues that we need to talk about. One of them is that we're spending major money on school capital construction because the Supreme Court ordered the state to abandon the old bond issue system and go to a state appropriation system. Uh, that's been done on a pork barrel basis, and you could justify about $1 billion of extra spending there. We've had 3 billion. We can't afford that anymore because we were financing it with coal lease bonus money, and that's gone. There isn't any. And so we don't have a good financing source. We've got to do something different. And I think return to an equalized version of the old bond issue system is the answer. And then something that has just come up, the University of Wyoming has been steadily improving over the years. And the rankings of universities I like are the Wall Street Journal ones because they emphasize the performance of the graduates in their first 10 years working. And that seems to me like a fairly good standard. And the university just took a major tumble from about number 250 nationally out of 750 to number 370 and went from being ahead of Colorado State to behind Colorado State and from being ahead of the University of Nebraska to being behind it and being ahead of everything in Idaho to being behind it. Something's going wrong there, and we need to figure out what the problem is. Did they change the ranking system? Have the university got a little too invested in the diversity inclusion kind of business? Have they done that to the harm of the undergraduate instruction? We're not clear yet what's going on, but there's an issue there the legislature is going to need to pay attention to.
so let me ask you this. So how do you think the state of Wyoming got to where it is right now in respect to education, the low reading scores you're talking about? And I mean, it's great that you're doing what you're doing right now and you're paying attention to it, but it would have been much better if 5 years ago somebody was dealing with this. How did this slip through the cracks?
Well, we've got a long history. Wyoming has always tended to do very well in terms of spending for the schools and always had, when I grew up here, uh, we were spending well in schools and the local management was not doing a good job at the upper levels in those days. And there was a local reform effort and that changed. Uh, and when I first got in the legislature, we were starting to have some funding problems and some equity problems. There was a series of court decisions, and they proved to be both a good thing because they forced us to do some things, and they have eliminated problems where certain school districts couldn't afford stuff. and forced us to more of an equalized approach that is putting our money where the problems really are. For example, in this state, unlike many others, the school districts on our Indian reservations are among the very best funded in the whole state because we know there's some problems there. We're trying to solve it with money. We're not succeeding. I think we're going to have to work with the tribes to try to get a different system there. I think there's some cultural things that the tribes maybe can cure that nobody else can. But we are putting our money where we need it. But the result has been that the local school district is less dependent on the voters in the local district and has been able to concentrate on empire building that is not serving the academic needs. And I think they've become complacent and just not performing very well. And I don't think Wyoming is unique in this respect at all. But we designed a marvelous assessment test, and until those consultants came along and used it, nobody'd been using it. And now the consultants in the legislature are using it. Maybe we can start to say, look, we've got to get some better results.
So how do you feel about the likelihood of success of these educational initiatives that you're going to be spearheading come next session?
I think they're pretty good. The problem we have had in the past few years has been the Senate has been willing to do educational reforms, has seen that there are deficiencies that we need to correct. And the House has had an education committee dominated by establishment educators who are frankly fat and happy and quite complacent. And the voters made a change in the primary election. And I think we'll have a House that is open to reforms. Now, we've got to do a good job of formulating the reforms and making them work and following through because we won't get it right the first time. You never do. We'll have to come in and refine things. But we need to get some reforms and reforms the locals can't evade. We did a reform back in 2001 where we put through a bill based on what an Arkansas school district was doing that said you had to look at what the individual children, what problems they were having, and fix those and have a plan to fix them. And most of the districts ignored it. So that's one of the things is getting a reform that they cannot ignore.
Sure.
Because
In respect
there
to,
really is a let's stand pat and we're doing just fine. No, we're
right.
not.
Yeah, clearly. I understand there was an early childhood education proposal that didn't get out of committee. Can you tell me about that?
There was an early childhood proposal that got enacted last year. It was the one to do a voucher program and trying to harness the private sector efforts because by the state constitution, the public schools don't extend down into those early years,
Sure.
and probably just as well because the issues are a little different. And that was the one the governor vetoed part of. We'll have to see what we can salvage and whether we have to redo that. There was also an effort to say, okay, if you're going to call yourself a preschool, you have to meet standards for kindergarten readiness, and I couldn't get agreement on that. So that's one we may revisit. But and that would be just trying to give the parents some ability to say, okay, if I want my child to go to kindergarten, ready for kindergarten, I got to send them to a private daycare or preschool that meets certain standards. And I think that's probably a way to go, use the private sector rather than try to get the K-12 system that's got plenty of problems in what its mandate is rather than try to extend them down into that. So we're going to have to explore that. And we think that will be helpful. The researchers we've talked to have told us that the best years for teaching a child to read are the kindergarten through third grade. That's when the brain is most adapted to it, and that it may well be that the preschool efforts ought to be focused on things like vocabulary and some just basics, alphabet and counting and that sort of thing, and not so much formal instruction in reading. It's a different animal there because the kids are younger, but it still looks like they'd be helpful. So that's one of the solutions we need to explore. But clearly, we're not getting the performance of the teaching in the early grades where the teaching ought to focus on reading. And I don't think it's a problem with the teachers. I think it's a problem with the priorities of the management.
So, for parents out there in Wyoming, what can you recommend that they do? Reach out to their state lawmaker and say, "Hey, when you come around
Yeah,
next session,
give us some support as we try, because the education establishment is going to scream like a stuck pig as we try to reform them. Do that. Be willing to take your child to a charter school or even a private school, and you may have to pay for that if your local public school is not performing well. And pay attention, because the parents can make up for a fair amount of the deficiencies. And if their child is having trouble, uh, I heard a lot of complaints from parents with children that were having trouble, and the parents trying to get something done about it, and they couldn't get the local school district to pay any attention. I've heard way too much of that kind of complaint. And so the parents have to be pretty aggressive in the current system. And if you can't get the locals to perform, look for alternatives. And
what?"
don't be bashful about talking to your school board. That's what they're for.
So, what's your sense? Why are some of these local school districts and leaders not taking the initiative that they clearly need to in order to get these kids to the level they need to be at?
Because they're not under the courts have insulated them from public pressure. They haven't felt they had to be responsive to it. And their personal priorities were building big bureaucratic empires. These local superintendents are making as much as, or even more than 200,000 a year. They're doing quite well, so they're pretty complacent. And
Sure.
some of them are saying, no, our primary mission is getting to all the kids. And I think even those could do better, but they're doing pretty well. And some of them are not paying attention to that and just writing the kids off that don't perform well. And that's no good.
Sure. Well, I appreciate your insight. I appreciate your time, and I'd like to continue this conversation, partway into the legislative session, if we can regroup then and see where things go, if that's okay.
Yeah, that may well be. And we've got to work on legislation between now and then so that we're ready for the session. Because it
Sure.
looks like this session will be a unique opportunity to actually get something done.
Got it. Well, good. And then maybe we'll talk right before to find out about the legislative initiatives that you've put together. So, Senator, I really appreciate your time. For people that want to learn more about what's going on around the state of Wyoming, just wyliberty.org. Sign up for our newsletter. Thanks again, Senator. We'll be in touch.
And thank you.